A thick, iron-scented steam rose from a basin of blood at George Washington's bedside. In the dim glow of a candle, a doctor pulled a lancet from Washington's arm. It was the 4th time that day they had cut the first president's veins. Warm, crimson blood trickled down his forearm, dripping onto the sheets. His once commanding voice was now just a strained, wet whisper. He gasped for air, each breath a shallow rattle in his swollen throat. Around him, the 3 physicians exchanged anxious, helpless glances. Martha Washington stood in the corner, hands pressed to her mouth in horror. The father of his country was bleeding to death before their eyes. This was no battlefield death. It was an agonizing final chapter for a national hero. George Washington, the victorious general of the Revolution and the first president of the United States, spent his last hours in excruciating torment, not from war or an assassin's bullet, but from a sudden illness and the very remedies meant to cure him. In December of 1799, only 2 years into his retirement, Washington fell gravely ill at his Mount Vernon estate. What followed was one of the darkest episodes in early American history. The great general who once seemed invincible was now at the mercy of primitive medicine, and that medicine turned his death into a nightmare of blood and pain. Just 3 days earlier, Washington had been healthy and vigorous. On December 12th, he spent hours riding through a freezing winter storm to inspect his plantation. That evening, rather than keep his guests waiting, he sat down to dinner in his wet clothes. By the next morning, he had a raw, scratchy throat that only grew worse as he stubbornly continued working outdoors in the cold. By nightfall, on December 13th, his voice was nearly gone, and he was noticeably ill. Still, no one suspected that by the following night, this minor ailment would explode into a fight for his life. After midnight, in the early hours of December 14th, Washington woke in sudden distress. A stabbing pain gripped his throat, and he found he could barely breathe. Each inhalation felt like fire in his windpipe. Martha awoke to her husband sitting upright, wheezing and clutching his neck. She begged to fetch help, but Washington refused to let her venture out into the bitter cold. Even now, he worried more about her health than his own. So they waited anxiously for dawn. As the first light crept in, a servant discovered the general gasping for air and raised the alarm. Washington's secretary, Colonel Tobias Lear, rushed to the bedside to find his friend struggling for each breath. Lear wasted no time. He dispatched a rider to fetch Dr. James Craik, Washington's longtime physician, and called for an overseer named Rawlins, who was skilled in bloodletting. Through rasping breaths, Washington managed to insist on one thing before the doctor arrived. He wanted to be bled immediately. Bloodletting had helped him in the past, and now it was the only remedy he trusted. Rawlins hurried in with a bowl and a sharp lancet. The early morning light revealed Washington's face, pallid and damp with sweat. His breathing was rapid and ragged. Rawlins tied a tourniquet around the general's arm and sliced open a vein. Blood spurted into the bowl. Washington grimaced, but did not flinch. He believed this drastic cure was his best hope. Ounce after ounce of blood flowed from his arm. Perhaps he expected to feel some relief. Instead, a wave of weakness washed over him. By the time nearly a pint had been drained, Washington was lightheaded and ghastly pale. The bleeding stopped, but his condition did not improve. His throat was still swelling shut, and his breathing was no easier. In fact, every treatment would only bring more agony. Dr. Craik arrived by mid-morning to a dire scene. Washington was feverish, barely able to whisper, his once mighty voice now a faint wheeze. Dr. Craik realized the general's throat was terribly inflamed and closing up more each hour. With no time to lose, he turned to the standard cures of the era. First, he applied a blistering plaster to Washington's throat. This caustic paste of cantharides was meant to draw out the disease by raising blisters on the skin. Instead, it only added to Washington's torment. The paste burned fiercely, and angry blisters soon bubbled along his throat, but the internal swelling remained. Croc then bled Washington a second time. More of Washington's life dripped away into a basin. His pulse faltered, and his skin turned cold and clammy. Martha watched in growing terror as her husband only weakened further. By noon, 2 more physicians had arrived, Dr. Gustavus Brown and Dr. Elisha Dick. Washington was only getting worse. His breaths were fast and shallow, and he could no longer speak at all. Desperate, the doctors tried everything they could. They administered an enema, but it had no effect. Then they forced a toxic brew down Washington's throat to induce vomiting, hoping to expel the blockage. The result was brutal. Washington convulsed with violent retching. He vomited again and again until he was empty and exhausted, tears of pain in his eyes. It was agony on top of agony, and it accomplished nothing. The deadly obstruction in his throat did not budge. Finally, the physicians returned to bloodletting, the remedy they knew best. They opened Washington's veins yet again, drawing blood bowl after bowl, soaking the sheets and fouling the air with its iron scent. All told, the doctors took about 80 ounces, nearly half of the blood in Washington's body, over the course of the day. By the last bleeding, Washington was deathly weak. His lips were blue, his face ashen. Any lesser man might have succumbed already, but still his heart kept beating. The treatments had pushed him to the brink, but the illness in his throat continued to strangle him. As dusk fell on December 14th, the frantic medical efforts finally ceased. There was nothing more to be done. George Washington lay drained and exhausted, scarcely able to move or breathe. Every rattling inhale was shallower than the last. Around 4:30 p.m., with trembling fingers, he gestured for Martha and Tobias Lear to come close. In a hoarse whisper, he asked Lear to bring his 2 wills from the study. He knew death was at hand. Even as his vision dimmed, Washington managed a few final acts of duty. He selected the will he wanted enforced and made provisions to free the enslaved people he owned upon his death, as he had long planned. With his affairs settled, he told his wife softly that the end was near. As evening deepened, Washington attempted one last act of resolve. Ever the soldier, he tried to sit up and dress himself, as if determined to meet death on his feet. But his strength failed him. He could barely lift his head from the pillow. At that sight, everyone knew the end was near. A hushed, helpless silence fell over the room, broken only by Washington's labored breaths. By 10 o'clock that night, George Washington was slipping away. Martha stood by his bed, tears running down her face, as she watched the life ebb from her beloved husband. Washington opened his eyes and mustered a final whisper. He thanked his doctors for their efforts and said he was not afraid to die. He only regretted that he must leave those he loved behind. Moments later, his breathing slowed and finally stopped. A profound stillness filled the room. Martha, choking back sobs, leaned over her husband's lifeless body and whispered a last goodbye. After a day of unimaginable agony, the father of his country was at peace. When the news broke that George Washington had died in such a horrific way, shock and grief rippled across the young nation. Americans mourned as never before. The hero of the Revolution, who had seemed larger than life, was suddenly gone. Many struggled to comprehend how a sore throat could have killed the invincible Washington. As the grisly details of his final hours became known, an uneasy question arose. Had the very doctors who tried to save him actually hastened his death? In newspapers and taverns, people began to question the aggressive bloodletting and bizarre treatments used on the beloved general. Bleeding, long a pillar of medicine, was now cast in a terrible light. Washington's death became a cautionary tale, a shocking example of how a trusted cure could turn deadly. His devastated friend Dr. Craik was haunted by guilt, unable to shake the thought that their remedies had killed his patient. The nation had lost its founding hero, but it also gained a grim lesson about the dangers of medical ignorance. Washington's legacy only grew in death, but behind all the public tributes lay the bitter truth of his end. Even this great man, for all his strength and wisdom, had been helpless against the limits of his era's knowledge. Even the greatest heroes are mortal. George Washington survived battlefields and bullets, but he was brought down by an invisible enemy in his throat and by the misguided care of his time. His agonizing death forces us to confront how fragile life can be and how even well-intentioned treatments can become instruments of torture. In 1799, bleeding and blistering were standard medical practice. Today, we shudder at the thought. Washington's fate is a somber reminder of how far medicine has advanced since then, and how many lives were lost to erroneous beliefs along the way. It's natural to wonder if Washington might have survived with today's medical knowledge, but in 1799, his fate was sealed by the limits of what his doctors knew. What we do know is that, in his final moments, Washington faced death with the same dignity and courage that defined his life. His story challenges us to consider our own strength in the face of mortality. Would we have the fortitude to endure such agony with the trust and courage that Washington showed? The tale of George Washington's death is a sobering lesson on the thin line between help and harm, and a reminder to be grateful for the hard-won knowledge that spares us from the horrors of the past. Thank you for listening to this dark and sobering tale. I invite you to share your thoughts in the comments. How does Washington's agonizing end make you feel about the progress of medicine and the fragility of life? If you found this story compelling and chilling, stay tuned for our next episode. Until next time, remember to appreciate how far we've come, and sleep well if you can.